Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, of a very special guest. His name is Alex Petkas. His last name is spelled Petkas. If you're watching this on YouTube, X, Rumble, Rockfin, you'll see the logo for his podcast. The title of the podcast is The Cost of Glory. It references a phrase, the cost of glory is always great. And he has had 114 very well researched episodes. And Mr. Petkas has a Princeton PhD, so he's very knowledgeable on history and classics, and that's kind of his focus. I think he's an expert on Plutarch and his parallel lives, like very important information. We were talking in the pre-show about how much of the classics is kind of evaporated from modern consciousness, and I think that's a shame. So we're going to talk about his work, his research, and specifically some of the recent episodes he did on Julius Caesar. I'm aware of about five of those. And we're going to just show kind of this kind of heroic lifestyle of Julius Caesar and why it's important and why people need to learn about this stuff about men of action and things, people who made changes in the world. We see a lot going on wrong in the world now. So hopefully people will step up and fill those roles. Maybe not my generation, but the generation after me can fix some of the things that are going wrong. But Alex can talk more about that. So Alex Petkas, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here with you, William.
Excellent. So, for people, I know you've done a lot of shows. I know you've been around and talked to a lot of different people. For people who haven't heard your name or your work or your academic accomplishments, maybe you could do or talk a little bit of expand on your biography, what led you up to the Cost of Glory podcast, and then we can talk about the importance of Julius Caesar.
Well, like a lot of young men today, and maybe in the previous generation, I kind of felt like I didn't get a great education in K through 12, and sort of started to get interested in school later. And I realized that I hadn't really had a founding in the classics or even knew what they were, and that's why I sort of went down that route in college and ended up sort of, despite for lack of a better plan, going on and doing a PhD and studying this stuff because I got kind of obsessed. And what I was really looking for, and I think that this relates hopefully to what a lot of people sense today, is that I was looking for role models, and I was looking for a kind of guide to how I ought to live, and inspiration above all. And I found that in some of the great heroic statesmen of the past, and also in some of the philosophers of the past. I was very interested in Plato and Aristotle, and especially in the way that these men had a lot of influence in their worlds beyond just being intellectuals. They were involved in politics and schemes. Plato did a big project in Sicily trying to win over a certain tyrant to his to a kind of more virtuous way of life. Aristotle famously was the tutor of Alexander the Great and had at least some influence on the man, maybe not a complete influence. But I was a scholar for a while, and I studied the Greeks, especially of the later Roman Empire. There's a lot of Greeks going on, in Rome, or the Roman Empire up through the Byzantine period. And I started to notice that there was something rotten in the state of classics early on in my career. And it seemed like the university system was becoming very feminized, constant talk of how we need to get more women in academia. And yet, if you look at the hiring patterns and the current faculty of universities, it's like past 50%, maybe it past 60% at this point, women. And there's just a kind of culture of not really deploying the classical wisdom and the figures of ancient history to inspire and instruct spirited young men who are looking to make something of themselves. And this has been the guide to excellence and to ambition, and to kind of restraining the bad impulses and kind of bringing out the good impulses in our civilization since 2000 years at least. So I had a tenure track job out in California, and just during COVID, it was actually a little bit before COVID that I made a decision. This place is not the place I want to spend my life, and there's other ways to reach people now through the internet. And so that was kind of the inspiration for me leaving academia, and at first for many years on the side building up this podcast, and now it's something that I'm able to work on full time. And what I do is essentially on the Cost of Glory, I try to retell the biographies of the great leaders of Greece and Rome, as you said, most of all following the lead of this great philosopher biographer Plutarch, who was probably the most influential biographer in history, even though he's a lot less well known today. He's sort of dropped off in popularity beginning in the 19th century for a lot of interesting reasons that we could get into if you want to go down that rabbit hole. But I want to bring the insights of Plutarch back to people, and the wisdom, and to kind of bring these characters to life so that they can not just be fun entertainment. Plutarch is a really good storyteller. He's just a Hollywood quality, depictor of character and scene, and kind of tragic arcs. But to live their lives better through the example of studying these great figures. And these figures do include people like I just mentioned, Alexander the Great, and I think probably the most famous figure that Plutarch wrote about was Julius Caesar himself, probably the most famous Roman, with good reason. And so I've been working on Caesar in particular. I thought that this would pass in a couple of months, me doing a life of Caesar, but I've really gone deep on Caesar for the past year, actually. And I think that he's actually, even today, he does enjoy a kind of popularity, grassroots, especially online, that the general take on Julius Caesar from the academic community, at least, and the kind of mainstream media, there was a recent BBC documentary on him, is that he's a bad tyrant, and Donald Trump is Caesar, therefore Caesar's bad, or vice versa. And so you can see their presuppositions there. But that's essentially what I see as my niche is explicating these lives and hoping that people will take up the call and make a difference in their own life through that study.
Wasn't Plutarch Lives, wasn't that kind of mandatory reading for young Romans back in the day? Like that was kind of I thought it was one of the main books that was given to citizens of Rome, if I remember. Is that correct?
Well, Plutarch is writing a little late depending on what you call late. He's writing in the late 1st century, early 2nd century AD. So it's the period of what's known as the five great good emperors, Trajan, Hadrian, and Antoninus Pius. So he's too late to influence men like Caesar or Cicero or Cato, but he writes their biographies. And he became popular sort of later on in antiquity. But where I think you see his influence the most powerfully is beginning in the Renaissance, where he kind of gets rediscovered by the Italian humanists. These texts get brought over with the fall of Byzantium, with all the other classics that kind of reach Italy in the 15th century. And Machiavelli is very interested in Plutarch, and so many of the great statesmen of history were obsessed with Plutarch. And this goes up through the 19th century, but the American founders in particular, the kind of golden age of Plutarch obsession is really the 18th century in Europe, and especially in the Americas. Plutarch is the first place that everybody would go to get a grounding in ancient history, and especially kind of the heroic tradition of ancient history. So he's the most popular ancient text in a very classically educated age, in the 18th century American colonies. Top ancient author, and top 5 book of any book that might be likely to be on your shelf. That's actually Plutarch's Lives. He's like right up there with the Bible, Pilgrim's Progress, a couple of other popular texts at that time. And so he's the most cited author in the Federalist Papers, as a matter of fact, often not by name, but it's clear from the reference that they're getting Hamilton and Madison are getting a lot of their stuff from Plutarch. Alexander Hamilton's reading Plutarch in the night at Valley Forge when he's the aide de camp of George Washington. He's taking notes in his pay book. We actually have a lot of his notes that he made about the lives of great state founders. So he's incredibly influential through being the conduit by which people get into the minds and into the lives and actions of, we mentioned Caesar. Alexander. Solon of Athens is another famous one. Lycurgus, the state founder of Sparta, who developed the kind of Spartan education system, the agoge, that kind of made these regular men to a warrior elite, and so on. So he's kind of the quintessential heroic author. Nietzsche was already starting to perceive his decline in the 1870s in Germany. And he said in a great text of his on the use and abuse of history, or on the advantage and disadvantage of history for life, he said to the young men of his day, satisfy your souls on Plutarch, and learn to believe in yourselves when you believe in his heroes. 100 such men who developed their taste for the heroic and kind of paraphrasing at this point here, who have kind of embodied that heroic spirit of Plutarch. He says they could silence now and forever the noisy pseudo-education of our age. So great
resonates to this day.
Yeah, it really does. And the education system that he's talking about is the Prussian kind of research university model of education, which is very influential on the American education system. We kind of imported in the US the German model as opposed to the British Oxbridge model, because we believed in the Enlightenment ideals of progress, especially in the post-Civil War period. The land-grant universities are mostly based on the German educational system, and this kind of trickles down. So we're kind of inheriting the system that Nietzsche was kind of critiquing even back in his day. So it's a really interesting story.
Right. So this is, why do you think that Plutarch has fallen out of favor here in the States? I mean, you say that the kind of Prussian thing, but it's like, why has this gone away? Why aren't people reading this or talking about it? Why isn't it in the public curriculum anymore?
It's a interesting pattern, and essentially what happens is America used to have this model of education in the 18th century in the colonies, sort of what Harvard and Yale used to do, which is a version of the Renaissance model, which is a version of the ancient model, which is humanities education, at least as we would call it today, was focused on rhetoric, on the art of speaking well and persuasion. But the whole rhetorical framework to education is not just about speaking well, it's about emulating great speakers. And it's also about emulating their character, and it's about kind of development and statesmanship. And what we kind of jettisoned in this transition to the university model was that in favor of this idea of the university as producing knowledge and science and experts in that knowledge, the multiplication of degrees and eventually PhDs. And so in that transition, the emphasis in the study of the ancient world and the classics became more focused on philology, is what they called it. The Germans really leaned into this idea of philology, which is the love of language, literally in Greek. And it becomes that the experts in classics are text critics. They're comparing various versions of texts. They're studying authors that they consider the greatest authoritative sources on facts, also in the kind of historical column, as opposed to the kind of literary column. So, Plutarch is a late author. He's not an eyewitness of any of the events that he depicts in the biographies. He's at least 100 years later than the latest figure he covers. And he was seen as kind of less objective, more of a great storyteller or a moralist than a historical source. And it was just less scientific to study Plutarch in detail, and in favor, people chose authors like Thucydides or Polybius, who are more eyewitnesses to the events that they depict. But I think it also kind of is related to this turn away from emulation of great examples to production of knowledge and production of experts. And so Plutarch kind of fell by the wayside. There are probably other reasons. He's got a huge corpus, so it's actually difficult to get your head around all of Plutarch to become a full Plutarch expert. Just is more than most grad students can bite off in one degree sitting.
When you say huge corpus, how many? There's the Parallel Lives, right, or 2 books of lives. Is that right?
Yeah, the Parallel Lives is his most famous work, and it's 48 biographies, each of them in modern editions 30 to 50 pages. So they're concise individually, but as a whole, it's it's comparable to the length of the Bible. And then he's got a whole other set of writings called the Moralia, which are various philosophical essays. Many of them are also great too, very influential on Emerson and Montaigne. And so it ends up, I have the Loeb collection of Greek editions behind me. It ends up being something like 15 Loeb editions of just the Moralia. So there's a whole lot out there, Plutarch, to chew on.
That's amazing. So he's very prodigious. He's not from Italy though, right? He's Greco. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So he's writing in this period where the Romans rule all the Mediterranean, including Greece. They've ruled Greece for 200 years or so. They really, I guess, 300 years by Plutarch's day. So he's writing in Greek for a Greco-Roman audience. He's writing for his contemporary Greeks in Greece, and he's also kind of writing for the educated elite of the Roman overlords, if you will, and many of them are very schooled in Greek at this time. But I think his project, and if you look at the way that the Parallel Lives is constructed, it's biographies that are paired with each other. He always pairs a Greek with a Roman that he sees as somehow comparable. And the easiest example to draw is Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, the greatest of the Greeks and the greatest of the Romans. And he compares their characters. He writes a little essay. Most of them survive. After he writes the biographies proper, he writes a little essay comparing their various strengths and weaknesses. And I think that the whole project was kind of partly conceived to help the Greeks appreciate the Roman heroes and help the Romans appreciate the Greek heroes by pairing them up together, and to kind of help these people understand each other, because he did travel to Rome and he did travel to Italy on his researches kind of late, and he likes the Romans. He thinks the Romans, I think, were better. They have a better constitution. They have a better kind of political system. The Greek political system was very, unstable and tended toward war and infighting. But he also thinks that the Greeks had kind of, maybe for that very reason, they possessed more of that manly, heroic excellence than your average Roman, or at least the Greek heroes, or I think he thinks are more impressive. So it's a very interesting project in that kind of civilizational comparison.
Right. And so he's writing about 150 years after Julius Caesar, right? Isn't that
That's right.
approximately it? So he has access to probably some of the stuff. The decline of the Roman Empire really hasn't maybe accelerated. So he has all that stuff. Caesar's really a remarkable person because his demise leads to the end of the
Republic.
Republic,
Yeah.
right now.
Mm-hmm.
I remember. Maybe you can just let's. You want to get started with the life of Caesar? I mean, it's an incredible life. It's very much like Alexander. It's got to putting those two together is pretty remarkable because of their ascent and their for like the victories are incredible. The battles are like for Solace and Elysia and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Caesar is, uh, well, he was an emulator of Alexander. It's worth pointing out, that there's a great scene in Plutarch's biography of him, which, by the way, Plutarch's Life of Caesar is one of his. I mean, if you want to start anywhere with Plutarch, that's a good one to start with, because that was basically the source text for Julius, Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. Shakespeare was a huge reader of Plutarch, and it inspired basically all of his Roman plays.
Interesting. That makes sense.
But in the life of Julius Caesar, Plutarch tells this story that one day when he's a young man, he's around 33. He goes to Spain and he's touring around in a provincial tour of duty. I think he might be a quaestor at this time. So, around 30, 33, he goes to this temple of Hercules in Cadiz in southern Spain. And he's with his friends, and, the friends they're looking at these various artworks. Ancient temples are kind of like their version of the museums. There's all these, extraneous statues and dedications in the temple grounds and inside the temple. And his friends are kind of moving on. And then Caesar is staying still by this statue of Alexander the Great that for some reason is in this temple of Hercules. And his friends look back and they're like, "What, Caesar? Are you weeping, Caesar?" And he says, "Yes, I'm weeping. Don't you think that it is not? Don't you think it is a matter for weeping that when Alexander was my age, he had conquered so many peoples and accomplished so much, and yet I, who am his age, have done so little in my life." So he's already at that age, like he knows the kind of magnitude of life that he wants to live, and he's really not made his rise yet by age 33. He's promising, but it was really in his 40s that he really got off the runway to greatness. And we could tell how that went as well.
He's not just a military hero. He's also he's a lot of his character. My understanding is overlooking his intellectual capacities as well. Didn't he write the Gallic Wars? And he was constantly like a man of letters. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. He's not just a brilliant general. I mean, really one of Rome's greatest generals, and we know this from his Gallic War commentary. And when that was a campaign that happened throughout most of the decade of the 50s BC. But Caesar has, they don't survive, but we have references at least to some of his early compositions. He was always writing something. He wrote a play when he was younger, I think, about Hercules, and a variety of other works. He was collecting a kind of quote book that Cicero mentions. And so he's always sharpening his tongue and his wit. And the place that you deploy that in Rome is in the law courts and in the Senate and in the forum, in politics. It's like the master skill, rhetoric, right? So there's a kind of literary culture among these Roman elites in Caesar's day. They're not just kind of trading speeches, political speeches back and forth, but they're writing poems. They're reading philosophy. Caesar was reading Lucretius's poem De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things. This classic epic poem about Epicurean philosophy, while he is on campaign in Gaul. He's taking the time in this, witheringly intense blitz through conquering all of France, basically a very warlike confederacy of Gallic tribes. And he finds the time to keep up his, reading the latest literary works coming out of Rome. And he's writing with Cicero and Cicero's brother to kind of give his opinion on various matters of concern in kind of Roman literary taste and circles. So I think this is a big part of keeping your intellect sharp, but also keeping a tab on the tastemakers of Rome. Caesar's such a careful cultivator of his personal style, both in his dress and in his manner of speaking, and in the way that he presents himself in his writings.
So he's always kind of aware of his social status. Wasn't he from kind of maybe a lesser aristocratic background, if I remember
Yeah,
correctly?
that's right. So Caesar is from the Julii clan, the gens Julia, which is, to be sure, one of Rome's great old families, and they claim descent from Aeneas, the mythic founder of Rome, and they had a history from the early kings period of Rome, the 6th century BC. But in Caesar's day, there, at least when he's young, there'd not been a lot of consuls and men in high office for a long time in this family. And so he's from a kind of glorious name, but not a lot of status or money. They're still in the Senate. So we shouldn't, say that this is some rags to riches story. But I think that the most interesting part of his youth is that he kind of, at least from the perspective of his family, winds up on the wrong end of the first Roman Civil War. So when Caesar's a teenager, there's this incredibly bloody war, probably as bloody, maybe bloodier than in terms of just casualties than the war that he eventually fought against Pompey. And that was, in his youth, it's the war between Marius and Sulla and the Marian faction after Marius dies. And essentially, it's a war between the populists and the oligarchs in Rome. And Caesar was allied with the populist faction, probably through more connections than this, but at the least because he was his aunt was married to Gaius Marius, the leader of the populist faction. And when Sulla, the oligarch, the optimate, as the Romans call him, wins the war, he goes on this purge of his enemies, and more than 1,000 prominent Roman men are listed and either exiled or executed, properties confiscated, and some of those include some of Caesar's family connections. It's likely, if Caesar's father had been alive at this time, that he would have been proscribed, but he had died maybe of a heart attack or something one day while tying his shoes, and Caesar was 12 years old. So he kind of grows up without his father figure in his teens. And so if Caesar's dad had been alive and had fought on the side that everybody would have expected him to fight on in the Civil War, not only would his property have been confiscated, but Sulla banned from office the sons of men who'd been proscribed. So Caesar was really he rose in this kind of narrow near miss of having no political career in Rome from his teenage years. And there's a famous interaction between him and the dictator Sulla after Sulla's won. Caesar is married very young, kind of uncharacteristically young for a Roman. And he is married to the daughter of Marius's successor, this guy named Cinna. Basically, he's married to the daughter of populist number one, who was public enemy number one for Sulla. And Sulla says, Caesar, I'll let you do your thing, and you can be a good boy in the new regime, but just divorce that wife of yours. It's a bad look for you if you want to actually make a career here in Rome. And Caesar says, no, thank you. I will keep my wife. And and so this is a big thing to stand up to the dictator of Rome, Sulla. And he goes into exile, and he eventually gets tracked down and brought back before Sulla, and Sulla's going to execute him for disobeying and kind of challenging him. But Caesar's friends plead with Sulla, oh, he's just a boy, let him go. And Sulla says, all right, I'll spare him, but you are fools if you don't see many a Marius in that boy. And so from this early age, he kind of knows the side that he's on, and he decides decisively for the populist side. So he's a populist all of his career, and he ends up basically, Sulla put in place a conservative, oligarchic, kind of plutocratic establishment, in terms of the people that were now running Rome. And Caesar spent his whole career aiming at sort of toppling that establishment, and he eventually pulled it off. It took a long
So
time.
he's kind of like an aristocratic, anti-establishment populist,
Yeah,
possibly.
yeah.
Okay.
And I
In
think
a
this
way.
draws interesting connections with Donald Trump. I mean, Trump obviously not a blue blood per se, but kind of from that charmed circle at one point in his career, Hollywood and big money in New York, and he kind of turns on them in
Right.
2015. And so and it's just those kind of people that the establishment hate the most, who kind of betray them,
Right.
as it
That's
were. And that
interesting.
was one of the reasons for Caesar's unpopularity, I think, among, and it kind of this sense that like he's just this demon bent on destroying the state, which becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy when the oligarchs really back him into a corner.
Right, but he kind of made his name kind of a different route, right? My understanding is his popularity only grew because of the Gallic Wars, right? That was kind of where he made his name outside of maybe doing politicking in Rome. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, yeah, he was, for in his younger years, he took on some notable cases that were seen as very populist, legal cases, prosecuting, members of the establishment for, the illegal murder of populist leaders. He dug up this very old case when he's in his 30s, and this kind of caused a stir. So he's sort of building up his credentials slowly over time, and most famously, I know you like these kind of crime stories and conspiracies, but the greatest conspiracy in Rome, in the Roman Republic, is the Catilinarian conspiracy. So and this happens before Caesar becomes consul. He's mid-30s. This another kind of fallen aristocrat, Catiline, um, tries to run for consul twice, and he ends up losing, and then he sort of plots this rebellion and the overthrow of the state, and he gets caught. Then he leaves the city and flees, but many of his minions are still in the city, and Cicero finally, who's the consul at the time, produces pretty incontrovertible evidence that these guys are plotting to murder senators, set fire to the city, like really bad stuff, and then like bring in an army to capture Rome. And so he hauls them before the Senate, the conspirators, Cicero does, and it basically says, all right, what should I do with these guys? He thinks that they should be executed. And there's a big debate in the Senate. Should we execute these men without a proper trial, just to do it right away on the day, because the threat to the state is so great? And many voices go back and forth, and it seems like the room is sort of leaning against execution. And then Julius Caesar stands up. He's a young guy, doesn't have a lot of credibility or reputation in the Senate yet, but he speaks in favor of not executing these men because it's against precedent. Let's put them in life in prison, and sort of stands up for them. A very kind of calculated point in his career, and it ends up swinging the other direction. Caesar's thereafter nemesis, Cato the Younger, speaks forcefully in favor of, like, let's execute them on this day, and they end up getting executed on that very day. But by taking up their cause, he kind of these men, they were going to advocate debt cancellation and redistribution of wealth and all of these crazy radical things. And Caesar sort of like took on some of the status of their defender. And there are a lot of suspicions at the time that Caesar was kind of in on the plot, but somehow he kept his hands clean and and managed to escape from it. I want to read one really quick quote about this that I pulled up. This is from Friedrich Nietzsche, Twilight of the Idols. He says, almost every genius knows as one of the phases of his development the Catilinarian existence, a feeling of hatred, revengefulness, and revolt against everything which already is, which is no longer becoming. Catiline, here it is, the antecedent form of every Caesar. So Caesar saw this kind of criminal element in Caesar that is fully expressed in Catiline. Caesar never does anything that illegal publicly, but Caesar kind of channels that anti-establishment energy into a more productive outlet, and the Gallic War is probably the most famous example.
A more productive form of Catalinianism, right? So he learned and
Right.
survived. Like he seems to have had really good survival instincts. So all these things, of these upheavals, he makes his way through his whole life. And then the Gallic Wars. What, I don't know why he got assigned to the Gallic Wars. Like back then, people don't know the kind of map or the expansion of the Roman Empire. It really was kind of the old map of Italy. Like there was a whole nother, that was all open territory, was France.
Yeah, that's right.
Caesar, right?
That's right. Yeah. So Rome at this point controls Spain kind of loosely. I mean, there's some, wild native areas in Spain, but they mostly have Spain, at least in the coast. They control North Africa for the most part, like Tunisia, especially. They control mainland Greece and a lot of the Balkans, but no, very little Roman presence in France. Just along the coastline, they have a kind of land bridge from Italy to Spain, and it's been a big source of security issues for them. Just in the previous generation or two before Caesar, there was a huge Gallic invasion. I mean, the sources say 300,000 Gauls are like, raining down on Italy. They actually cross the Alps and they get into northern Italy, and they get stopped by Caesar's, uncle-in-law, Gaius Marius. So it really is a wild area. It's loose tribal confederations kind of constantly warring with each other for supremacy, a lot like the Greek city-states in earlier era. But these men are seen by the Romans as, they're taller, they're hot-headed, they're fighting all the time, so they're tough, and they're, every now and then, if things go one way in the internal politics of Gaul, some charismatic chieftain might decide, Rome's a really juicy apple for the plucking, and actually in the kind of branded in the Roman historical mythic consciousness, not mythic in the sense that it didn't happen, but they're kind of, their story of the important events of Roman history. In the 4th century BC, Gauls actually captured and sacked Rome in this invasion. So, they have this fear inborn of the Gauls, and Caesar saw that now was the time to conquer Gaul and to pacify it. And he actually, the way that you would become a commander and get assigned a military office was you have to get kind of picked by the Senate to do that job. And they will typically only pick, with very few exceptions, they'll typically pick office holders. And so what he did is he ran for consul in the year, to be the consul of the year 59 BC. And he made a deal to get, this is the first triumvirate. He made this deal with Crassus, the richest man in Rome, and then Pompey, the most kind of influential commander who was resident in Rome at the time, to kind of mobilize their voter blocks to get Caesar elected. And he was the junior colleague. It was really like a duumvirate. It's like two guys, like those are the big guys, Crassus and Pompey. And Caesar is just this kind of little politician on the rise. But he says, if I'm consul, I can pass all these laws in your favor. Just support me. And so they support him. And one of the things that he wanted out of the deal was for them to also mobilize their influence to get him picked for the Gallic command, because he saw this as like the opportunity to really make his mark on Roman history. So it was not an accident that he got sent to Gaul, and he saw the opportunity there, and he had to, tremendous, clever, difficult political machinations to pull off this command, but he pulls it off in 59, and then he actually gets sent out to the war in the following year in 58, and it takes him about 7 years to fully pacify Gaul.
Right, and it's huge battles. One of my favorite battles to read about in history is the Battle of Alesia, which is an incredible. I mean, there's all kinds of battles. Like you say, it's 7 years. He's writing about it, but the final, I think it was the final battle against Vercingetorix, if I
That's
remember
him, yeah.
correctly. But maybe you could talk about some of the battles leading up to Alesia, because I think that was the final pacification, if I remember, or close to it, if I remember.
That's right. Yeah. So there are some really amazing battles in the early years of the campaign. The first campaign is against the Helvetians, who are from Switzerland, Gallic tribe. They're trying to migrate to another section of Gaul, kind of out of the mountains into the richer plains. And Caesar kind of uses the Helvetians as the casus belli, the kind of provocation to start and get involved in Gaul. And they're trying to cross through the territory of some Roman allies. And then there's just little sliver of Roman controlled lands that they need to cross. Otherwise, they're going to have to go through the mountains and it's going to be really hard. And so they ask the Romans, all right, we got several 100,000 people we want to move with our carts. We don't want to do any trouble. Let us just kind of cross through your province. And Caesar says, because he's the governor of this particular province, he says, all right, give me 2 weeks to think about it and talk to the Senate, and can you just wait 2 weeks and I'll get back to you with an answer. They're probably thinking, yeah, probably yes. This is a small ask. And then within those 2 weeks, Caesar recruits 2 legions, so 10,000 men. Maybe it's 3 legions. He just gets this massive muster of troops, and he pulls up his army and he builds this huge wall across or along the bank of the river that they would have to cross, and basically he fortifies the position. And then the ambassadors come back on the specified day and he says, nope, can't cross, sorry. and they're understandably annoyed, and they try to cross anyway, and they get defeated in a battle. And so they go around the hard way through the mountains, which actually leads them through another territory of other Roman allies, and they end up burning some huts and ravaging some fields because they're hungry. And Caesar says, all right, these people clearly are a security threat to our allies in Gaul, because Rome has allies here and there, loosely held. And so he marches around the Jura Mountains, this kind of western spur of the Alps. And long story short, he defeats them in a huge battle in which he's massively outnumbered. But the Romans have a really, really sophisticated logistics apparatus. Like, they're really good at these longer wars where feeding your men becomes a big issue, feeding your pack animals, fortifying the right ground. He ends up building a fort on a kind of gentle hill and sort of lures them into battle. And so they're fighting uphill, and his troops are fighting downhill, and they have better equipment. So all of these factors and they're hungry too. So they want a decisive battle to get this over with because their supply lines are all stretched. And Caesar, even though the Romans have these great logistical and military technology systems in place, Caesar just knows how to maximize their impact. And you see that, and that's in the book 1 of the Gallic Wars, this first great victory at the name's escaping me right now. It's in central France, basically. But the battle you reference, well, I mean, there's many examples of this, but just one more example of Caesar's bravery. He's actually known for being a personally very, very daring man. He wins this civic crown when he's a young 20-year-old, which means he risked his life to save the life of a fellow Roman citizen on a campaign in Greece. And so you see this in many of the battles in the Gallic War, not in the one I just mentioned, but in this other one with another very warlike tribe, the Nervii in Belgium, in book 2, where they get ambushed by this massive, massive army of warlike Belgian Gauls, and the lines are starting to buckle. His men are surprised and they're confused, and he's just running around the battlefield to the different regiments, cheering them on, grabbing the guy who's carrying the standard and saying, "Hey, the battle's that way," and turning him around. And at one point he launches himself into the front lines and leads his men, putting his own person at great risk. And you see this in many instances in the Gallic War campaigns, where it's the personal example of the leader that motivates the men, that kind of turns a battle from a defeat into a victory. So he really had that bravery and that kind of magnetic charisma that could really bring out the best in an army.
Like Alexander, right? So he's right there in the thick of
Absolutely.
stuff. So he's taking that example out of Plutarch,
Yeah.
or Plutarch is making that similarity.
Leaders like we used to have, in the West, and maybe there's some around today, but it's not common anymore.
But he wasn't a young guy at that time, right? I mean, during the Gallic Wars, was he in his 40s or 50s, if I remember? Is that right?
Let's see. So Caesar's born in 100 BC, and the Battle of Alesia is in 52. So I guess he's late 40s, 48, and he's but he keeps himself young by exercising all the time, fast forced marches. He's constantly in action. He's a light eater. He's a light sleeper. I think he just has one of these internal dynamos where he's got an incredible power, an incredible capacity for work, and his speed is one of his biggest advantages in wars. He's always there days before you expect him, and he'll surprise his own troops sometimes, showing up when they thought he was 2 weeks away. So
interesting. Yeah, Alesia is interesting because he trapped Vercingetorix on a hill and built earthworks around the entire hill.
Yeah.
And then another troop of Gauls was coming. So he built another fence and put all his troops in between both fences and then fought the battle, something like that. Something crazy.
Yeah, and the Great Revolt is a great story. It's one of the best books of the Gallic Wars. There's 7 books that he wrote. 7, I guess you call them chapters today, but 7 books that he wrote kind of by year, starting in 58. And then the 8th book was written by a friend of his after he died, that kind of does the mop up after the Battle of Alesia. But the final book that he wrote for 52 is there you go. It's about the Great Revolt. So Caesar has, kind of inch by inch pacifying Gaul and making allies of the people that he conquers, and there's all these internal politics to these various confederations of Gallic tribes. And but one day the Gauls kind of realize slowly that the Romans at first seemed like they were just going to be the big man that they could call in to kind of help them clobber the other tribe. And then at some point the Gauls realized, wait a second, if we keep calling in Rome's help, we're going to eventually just become Roman subjects, and we're going to lose our way of life, and we're going to have to make war when they tell us to make war and make peace when they tell us to make peace. And at some point, a young noble, Vercingetorix, who probably had fought in Caesar's allied cavalry at some point, because Caesar, in his campaigns, the Romans have infantry as typically Roman citizens, or recruits that are going to be awarded with citizenship at the end of the campaign, Italians typically. But for their cavalry, usually they use local operators, the nobility, because the cavalry are the wealthy. So you're kind of making friends with the leaders of society. And so Vercingetorix was probably one of these cavalrymen that he had on an earlier campaign. So he knows the Roman tactics. He knows the way that the Romans operate, probably knows Latin. And he raises up the torch of rebellion. It's like, this is our last chance as Gauls, as a people, to throw off the Roman yoke. And he manages to, convince almost all of Gaul to rise up against Caesar. Even like long-standing Roman allies like the Aedui end up fighting for Vercingetorix. And as you say, it kind of ends up in this siege of this hill fort, Alesia, in I think it's in Burgundy now, kind of eastern France, or near there. And the walls that he builds to siege Alesia that you mentioned are, I think it's the inner wall is 13 miles in circumference, and then the outer wall is 15 miles. And it's not just a wall; it's a big, 15, 20-foot high wall, and then there's an earthwork, and then a ditch that's filled with water, then another earthwork, and then a ditch that's filled with spikes, and then a whole kind of field leading up to the first ditch. There's all these like hidden spikes in the ground. So, incredibly intricate defense work that they just throw up in a matter of days with the Roman army is just this, moving construction company. And and even then, the Gallic army that they're able to fight off just dwarfs the size of the Roman troops. It's like 10 times as big, or at least 5 times as big. We're talking 100,000 men, maybe, at least if you trust the sources. But again, the Gauls' problem is they don't necessarily have the logistics to support that many mouths for a long period of time. And so they're kind of forced to call the matter to an issue through battle sooner than the Romans. The Romans can kind of wait them out and fight the war on the battle on their own terms. But the final battle, it happens over a series of days, and the Gauls eventually break into the outer wall. This kind of rescue army that came to free the besieged Vercingetorix, and at that kind of critical moment, the Romans managed to turn the tide back and rout the whole army, and then Vercingetorix famously surrenders. There's a great painting of this, and I think Caesar kind of admired Vercingetorix more than any of the Gauls. He has this kind of heroic, tragic figure that tries to kind of liberate his own people, but ends up succumbing to Rome and surrendering.
Right. I mean, and I think they took Vercingetorix to Rome for some kind of like ritual death, right? I mean, isn't something
Yeah,
like,
that's right. Yeah, it's there's the painting. Wow, what a scene, right?
yeah.
And so Vercingetorix would have been in captivity from 52, and then immediately after the Gallic War campaign, he goes into fighting the Civil War in 49, and he doesn't really have a chance to breathe until 46 BC. After 3 years of civil war, he finally holds his triumphal procession, which typically you'd celebrate right after you get done with the war, but he's kind of put it off because Rome's, in a civil war, there's no time for a triumph. And then the norm that Caesar is following is the enemy leader gets executed in the ritually in right in the center of Rome, in front of the Temple of Jupiter, I believe, is where that happens. So that was Vercingetorix's eventual fate, but he had to wait about 6 years
I didn't know that.
in captivity. So
they brought him back
happy
to like, ritually kill him, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's really an amazing arc, his life. It's really something else of Caesar crossing the Rubicon, right? So he brings his troops in.
Yeah, and I think that Caesar didn't set out to wage civil war on Rome after he conquered Gaul, or to set himself up as a dictator or a tyrant. He was what provoked the civil war that he fought was he wanted to return to Rome in peace and have the right to run for the consulship the following year. Whereas his enemies wanted to basically prosecute him into ruin and exile for various alleged crimes, and they wanted him to kind of lay down his command and dismiss all of his armies, and then return to Rome as a private citizen. And he was asking for an exception. They actually granted the exception to let him, run for the consulship in absentia. The details I've gone through in a couple of episodes in my podcast, but and they grant the exception, and they kind of go back on their word. So they kind of broke faith with him, and the justifications that they used were kind of like Caesar wants to set himself up as a tyrant, and so on and so on. but
Right. Claims of tyranny, kingship, or something. Sounds
yeah,
remarkably familiar. I don't know. Seems
yeah,
right.
and it was kind of lawfare. It's like this breakdown in the trust in the legal system that
Right.
I think we've seen a lot of in our day.
Yeah.
The legal system kind of getting abused to political ends, especially by the left in the past 4 years. But it 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 becomes a very dangerous game, because once that starts to be the norm, then you know people don't really put a lot of faith in law and order, and that's when real serious breakdowns happen, like what happened with the Roman Civil War.
Right. And that was all finished at. It was him against Pompey at Pharsalus, right? Isn't that the final
Yeah,
battle? Yeah.
yeah, that's right. So Pompey is his former son-in-law. Pompey married Caesar's daughter, and they had a loving relationship. They had a child, but Julia, his daughter, died in childbirth, and that kind of eventually severed the ties between the men. And they were friends. And then basically, Pompey's at Rome, and he's always been a kind of sort of outsider to the oligarchic noble establishment, and wanted to get acceptance from them as Rome's great man. Pompey was a great conqueror, but not from one of the good families. And so it's sort of through that carrot of, hey, you can be the great man in Rome, Pompey, but you just have to help us, you know, end the lawlessness of Julius Caesar, and bring him to his knees, and get him to submit to law and order. And they kind of get in his head, I think. It's a year or two that these negotiations go back and forth to try to negotiate Caesar's peaceable return to Rome. And it ends up um, people telling Pompey, hey, if Caesar comes back, he's going to displace you as the greatest man in Rome. So they're appealing to his ego. And sadly, he ends up taking up the sword against Caesar. And yeah, they were better funded. The Optimates, they had more soldiers, they had more ships, and they end up fleeing to Greece when Caesar crosses the Rubicon, and Caesar follows them. And the final battle at Pharsalus is actually comes in the wake of Caesar being defeated by them at the Battle of Dyrrhachium. So it's kind of Caesar's last shot, really, to survive, not just politically, but personally. And it's a great upset victory. Another great kind of example of
Reflected
Caesar's
in
brilliant generalship.
right in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar too. Pompey falls on his sword, and who was his
Yeah,
other that Caesar? He calls him lean and hungry man or
yeah,
whatever.
yeah. Brutus and Cassius actually
Cassius.
are.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's
yeah. So there's another battle after Caesar dies, the Battle of Philippi,
Philippi. Okay,
where
so that's in Shakespeare. I got it mixed up.
right. So I think Pompey's dead by the beginning of Caesar, and they're kind of this this kind of common man encountering the aristocrats. They're joking about, we forgot who Pompey is, and the aristocrats are telling them, shut up, don't you, have you forgotten the laurels that you heaped upon the statues of Pompey, and now you're heaping them upon the statues of Caesar? Oh, how fickle is the crowd. And but yeah, so people, after Caesar wins the Civil War, there are plots reported already, a ways before he actually gets assassinated. And Caesar famously dismisses these plots. He's saying, let them kill me if they want to. I've lived long enough for glory or for nature. And he decides not to have a bodyguard, to kind of loosen up he doesn't want to be a dictator. He doesn't want to be a kind of tyrant lording it over the Romans. He wants to be the first among free men, ideally. And Cicero comments like, hey, you should up your security and make sure you survive, because if you die, we're going to be plunged into civil war again. And it's eerie to to hear Cicero say this in some of the speeches a year or so before Caesar's actually assassinated, because that's exactly what happens. They assassinate
exactly what
Caesar, and
happens.
immediately, the war breaks out again between a different faction, but more or less the same story.
Isn't it true that he renounced the throne? Like he's offered the throne 3 times. Is that historically accurate?
Yeah, it is. Although there's kind of debate and interpretation whether he whether it was maybe a propaganda show to kind of win the favor of the Roman people. He's offered a crown. The Senate votes him royal honors. They vote him divine honors. Some of these honors he rejects. Some of them he quietly accepts. But I think that even though he didn't set out to be a monarch or an emperor, by the time the Civil War is over, he's starting to see that this is probably the best solution for Rome, that one man rule, and that one man control a stable imperial system, because Rome doesn't have a stable imperial system at this point. They have governors cycling through every 1 or 2 years. There's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of incompetence. People don't take the job seriously because they're going back to Rome in a year or two. So you might as well plunder the place while you're out there in Greece or Judea or wherever the case may be. So I think Caesar actually, and this is a longer story than we have time for, but I think that it was a reasonable policy to say Rome's political system needs a transition. And I think all of Caesar's best ideas were taken up by Augustus, but that's a story for another day. And it took a lot more blood and war and scheming to get there.
It's an amazing story. His life is really something else all the way to the end. Caravaggio asked, would you ask about Caesar's religious significance? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah, a lot. Well, Caesar is, he starts to be compared to the gods in his own lifetime. He accepts divine honors like right before he's killed, and this is not so strange in the broader Mediterranean scheme, because at this time he's had his liaison with Cleopatra in Egypt. That happened kind of in the middle of the Civil War, and the norm for these Eastern Mediterranean Greek monarchs was to, especially in Egypt, the pharaoh is a kind of living embodiment of the god. Horus for the men, and then Isis for the women, and so I think in Rome it doesn't play very well, but it would have played very well in the provinces. And Caesar's been to all the provinces, and he knows that if you want to have this giant empire, you need to have a basis for loyalty. And so I think that's where his leaning to accept those divine honors comes from. That and eventually, of course, the emperor becomes a quasi-religious figure. There's imperial cult, honoring the genius or the kind of guiding spirit of the emperor, which is sort of like divine honors for the emperor. And that really gets established. Really, it's Augustus who establishes that by declaring over and over again that he is the son of divine Julius. I think Caesar was a little uncomfortable with that, but Augustus, once you're, the successor, you can declare the man before you a little bit less problematically as a divine, God blessed, maybe divine himself, ruler. And then of course, as his successor, maybe you're divine too. So that's how that worked out. Broad scheme. It's a very interesting story though.
It's like divinity drive towards human divinity or something, godhood. It's almost like Alexander wasn't Alexander declared a god in Egypt too? I don't know, maybe.
Yep. Yeah. He's he circulates the story that he's the son of Zeus or the son of Amun-Ra, who is Zeus in the Greek interpretation. And this doesn't play well with the Greeks, but it plays very well with his Oriental subjects. Right, so that's where the pattern really starts.
Right. The subjects like it. So Really interesting. Great talk. Alex, we are at the hour mark. Is there anything else you'd like to add? I have your website up here. Like this is only like I think you only covered Julius Caesar for 5 or 6 episodes, right? So they can
Hmm.
go check out your podcast or links to your podcast at costofglory.com, right?
That's right. Yeah, the Caesar series starts with Caesar Part 1, which is episode 107. I did the Gallic War campaigns before that, and if you go there, you'll hear it from his birth on and his rise to power. I'm almost finished with the final episode that tells the story of his death. Right, that's what I'm working on right now. So that's coming soon.
Coming soon. And then also you have a Substack too. I just read through that. You have a Substack where
Hmm.
people can follow your writings. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, I'm not super active on Substack, but I do send out the occasional thought or article. It's a great way to keep in touch if you want to find me. My website's costofglory.com. And that has links to most of the stuff that I'm working on. We also do offer online rhetoric courses if you're interested in that kind of thing. But yeah, would love to hear from anybody interested in Caesar, and I would exhort people to, that it's kind of our duty to the next generations to pass on these stories of the great heroes, even if they're somewhat problematic. I mean, just because somebody's a hero doesn't mean that they didn't make mistakes that we can't learn from. But you can't really learn from somebody's mistakes if you think that they're a tyrant and the devil and wicked. You can't like really learn from them if you totally write them off, which I think has been the habit until recently.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because you mentioned at the early beginning of this talk, like how many people reference Plutarch and learn from these guys. And well, this is the foundation of our republic, is learning from Greece and Rome. All these things and the acts they did and the mistakes they made, and learn from all that stuff. So it is important to go back and reread it and also like see the good thing. Like Caesar's an amazing figure, like as
Hmm.
much as like you say, but he's also an academic, he's intelligent, he's savvy politically. You don't get to that point by being clumsy politically at all. So I mean, it's something to learn about these days. So I definitely recommend it. Again, it's The Cost of Glory. You can check it out, and it's Alex Petkas, Petkas, right? That's how you spell your last name.
That's right. Yeah.
And then also I'll put a link to, I know that you're active on Twitter. You have a lot of
Hmm.
followers over there. So I'll put a link to both your website, Twitter, and your podcast. People can listen to your podcast on all major kind of podcast platforms. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. I'm on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube. I hope coming soon to, Rumble and some of the other platforms, but it's limited resources here. But yeah, and at Cost of Glory on Twitter, if you want the occasional post on Roman history or ancient philosophers. I've been doing a lot of Caesar posting lately because he's been on my mind.
And you can listen to them right from the website. I mean, you've got a player here too. So there's a lot of options there, but people check it out. And I'll be checking it out as well. But again, thanks so much, Alex. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks, William. Really enjoyed it.
Cool. Stay there. Let me just shut this. I have to